Okay, so imagine that you want to construct an economic empire that outlasts 3 separate iterations of the nation-state, survives 2 world wars, and extracts a permanent tax on an entire region's gross domestic product without ever filing a single corporate tax return. You want to control the price of every loaf of bread, every ton of cement, and every liter of water across a landmass of 25,000 square kilometers. You need to maintain a private force of thousands of operational personnel, enforce absolute contract compliance without a court system, and operate continuously for over a century and a half. Sounds impossible. And yet, for the better part of 150 years, the Sicilian Mafia didn't just accomplish this. They made it the dominant business model of southern Italy. When modern analysts look at organized crime, they often fall into the trap of treating it as a failure of law enforcement or a sudden outbreak of moral decay. They view it as a parasite that attaches itself to an otherwise healthy economy. But economists who study the structural origins of the mafia, such as Diego Gambetta of the University of Oxford, arrive at a fundamentally different conclusion. The Sicilian Mafia was not a parasite. It was a business enterprise created to fill a structural vacuum in the market for protection. It was an industry born out of a very specific macroeconomic failure, operating in a market where the state was simply unable to guarantee property rights. To understand why this system lasted so long, you have to look at the exact historical and economic conditions of mid-19th century Sicily. In 1861, the unification of Italy formally annexed Sicily to the newly formed Kingdom of Italy. But the distant government in Turin and later Rome had virtually no operational authority on the island. The old feudal system had just been abolished, which meant that vast tracts of land were suddenly privatized and split up among thousands of new owners. For the first time in Sicilian history, smallholders owned land, cattle, crops, and equipment. But there was a critical problem. The new Italian state lacked the police force, the judicial infrastructure, and the administrative capacity to protect this new private property. In a standard market economy, the state holds a monopoly on violence and uses that monopoly to enforce contracts and prevent theft. When the state fails to provide that service, property owners do not simply give up. They buy protection from alternative suppliers. In 19th century Sicily, those alternative suppliers were private enforcers, former estate guards, and local middlemen. They realized that selling security was far more profitable than farming. This was the birth of what economists call the market for private protection. The early mafioso was not selling illegal drugs or running high-stakes gambling rings. He was selling trust in an economy where no one trusted the government, the courts, or each other. The genius of this early model lay in its self-reinforcing market dynamics. In a normal economy, high trust reduces transaction costs. If you buy a herd of cattle, you sign a contract, pay the market rate, and rely on the legal system if the seller delivers diseased livestock. In 19th century rural Sicily, where legal recourse was non-existent, transaction costs were paralyzing. A buyer had no way of knowing if the seller would steal the cattle back the next day. The mafioso stepped into this friction. By guaranteeing that a transaction would be honored under the explicit threat of violence against anyone who breached the agreement, he reduced transaction costs for the transacting parties while capturing a massive economic rent for himself. Consider the citrus groves of the Conca d'Oro around Palermo during the late 19th century. Lemon trees were among the most capital-intensive agricultural assets in Europe at the time. A lemon orchard required years of heavy investment in irrigation systems, specialized labor, and long-distance transport logistics before it produced a single euro of profit. Furthermore, the crop was highly vulnerable to sabotage. A rival could sever a water pipe or slash a harvest in a single night, wiping out years of capital investment. Historical data compiled by economists Arcangelo D'Amico, Alessia Isopi, and Margherita Olsen shows a direct statistical correlation between the density of citrus production in Sicily during the 1870 and the emergence of early mafia units known as Kosh. The mafia did not target the poorest regions. It targeted the highest value supply chains where capital was immobile, vulnerable, and desperate for security. To scale this protection business from a series of rural extortion rackets into an institutional monopoly, the mafia developed a specialized economic mechanism, the protection racket loop, known locally as the pizzo. The pizzo is often misunderstood as simple extortion, but structurally it operates as an extra-legal tax. The math behind the mechanism was brutally efficient. If a mafioso demands 5% of a construction business's monthly revenue, the owner faces a straightforward calculation. Paying the 5% guarantees operational stability, access to private arbitration for business disputes, and immunity from local petty crime. Refusing to pay results in arson, property destruction, or physical elimination. Over time, this dynamic creates a systemic cartelization of the legal economy. When every contractor in a city pays the pizzo, the mafia effectively acts as a central planning board. If 5 construction firms are competing for a municipal contract to build a road, the local mafia boss dictates which firm wins the bid. The winning firm inflates its cost estimates to account for the mafia's cut, while the other 4 firms submit intentionally higher bids to create the illusion of a competitive market. The state pays double the true market rate for substandard infrastructure, the contractors retain guaranteed profit margins, and the mafia extracts a high-margin dividend without taking on operational risk or capital expenditure. By the mid-20th century, this economic machine expanded far beyond agricultural fields and municipal contracts. Following the destruction of World War II, Western nations invested billions in reconstruction, and Sicily entered a period of rapid urbanization known as the Sack of Palermo. Between the late 1950s and the late 1970s, hundreds of historic buildings were demolished, and thousands of concrete residential units were erected across the city. The mafia transformed from a rural agrarian regulator into an urban real estate and construction conglomerate. Estimates by Italian law enforcement and academic researchers suggest that during the peak of this construction boom, over 80% of all building permits in Palermo were granted to a small group of dummy corporations linked to mafia families. The financial scale was staggering. Millions of metric tons of low-grade concrete flowed through supply chains controlled entirely by criminal cartels. The economic impact was twofold. First, it allowed the organization to absorb thousands of unskilled laborers, building a loyal social base dependent on mafia-controlled employment. Second, it created a massive mechanism for laundering cash generated from emerging international criminal markets. When international narcotics trade routes expanded in the 1970s and 1980, the Sicilian Mafia was uniquely positioned to act as the primary logistics manager for the transatlantic heroin trade, a network later documented by federal prosecutors as the Pizza Connection. The organization leveraged its existing geographical nodes across Sicily, North Africa, and the United States to build a supply chain that imported raw opium base from Southwest Asia, refined it in clandestine laboratories scattered across rural Sicily, and exported pure heroin directly into major American cities. At its peak in the early 1980s, anti-mafia prosecutor Giovanni Falcone and researchers from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that Sicilian families controlled roughly 80% of the heroin supply entering the United States. The cash flow was unprecedented for an extra-legal entity. The profit margins on heroin processing were upwards of 1,200%. The money returned to Sicily not in small sacks of physical currency, but through complex financial networks involving offshore accounts, shell companies, and compromised regional banks. According to investigative records from the landmark Maxi trial in Palermo, which eventually indicted 475 members of the organization, the Sicilian Mafia was generating an annual turnover that rivaled the revenues of major European multinational corporations of the era. United Nations estimates and historical financial audits placed the organization's net income in the billions of US dollars annually during this period. To put this in perspective, the liquid cash reserves of the major Sicilian families during the early 1980s exceeded the total tax revenue collected by the entire regional government of Sicily. However, an economic system built on extra-legal enforcement and hyperinflated margins contains an inherent structural flaw. Because there is no legal framework to govern property rights within the cartel, internal competition cannot be settled through corporate litigation, board votes, or market share shifts. The ultimate arbitration mechanism within a criminal economy is violence. When cash inflows scale too rapidly, the incentive to violate existing territory sharing agreements becomes overwhelming. This structural failure mode triggered the Second Mafia War between 1981 and 1984. A faction from the town of Corleone, led by Salvatore Riina, recognized that the traditional balance of power among the Palermo families was fragile. The Corleonesi initiated a systematic corporate takeover through asymmetric warfare, assassinating over 1,000 individuals, including rival bosses, lieutenants, high-ranking police officials, judges, and politicians. From a purely economic perspective, this period of extreme violence was a catastrophic failure mode for the business model. Up until the 1980s, the Sicilian Mafia had maintained its longevity by keeping violence localized, targeted, and quiet. They operated with a high degree of state capture, maintaining implicit non-aggression pacts with key members of the political establishment who turned a blind eye to economic extraction in exchange for guaranteed bloc voting during elections. By initiating an open war against rival factions in the Italian state itself, the Corleonesi destroyed the political consensus that had protected the system for over a century. The economic cost of this instability was immediate. Capital flight hit the region hard. Legal businesses folded, international investment evaporated, and the cost of maintaining political protection skyrocketed as public outrage forced the state to react. The ultimate breaking point occurred in 1992. In a desperate attempt to force the Italian government back to the negotiating table and halt the legal rulings of the Maxi trial, the organization executed high-profile bombings that killed anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. The public and political backlash was unprecedented. The Italian government deployed thousands of military troops to Sicily under Operation Sicilian Vespers, the first large-scale military deployment on Italian soil since World War II. The state enacted Article 41 bis of the Prison Administration Act, imposing severe isolation regimes on convicted mafia bosses to sever their communication with operational networks on the outside. Within a decade, the top operational leadership of the old organization was systematically dismantled, incarcerated, or forced into perpetual hiding. The financial infrastructure was hit with sweeping asset forfeiture laws that allowed the state to seize billions of euros in real estate, corporate shares, agricultural land, and bank accounts tied to mafia frontmen. Yet despite the collapse of its mid-century empire, the structural history of the Sicilian Mafia leaves a persistent, sobering legacy in the modern economy. The system did not simply vanish when its bosses were put behind bars. Its mechanisms adapted and migrated. The loss of institutional trust, the decades of underinvestment in legal infrastructure, and the systematic distortion of free market competition left deep economic scars across the region. Modern economic studies on southern Italy consistently point to a phenomenon known as the persistent development gap. Regions that were dominated by mafia protection networks for over a century continue to suffer from lower productivity, lower labor force participation, higher costs of capital, and lower rates of corporate innovation compared to northern counterparts. When private protection replaces the rule of law for generations, it degrades the social capital required for modern economic growth. Furthermore, the operational methods perfected in the lemon groves of 19th-century Palermo and the high-rise building sites of the 1960s were absorbed by global finance. Modern money laundering techniques, multi-jurisdictional shell structures, and trade-based financial fraud all trace their operational heritage back to the networks forged to move illicit capital out of southern Europe. The old bosses are gone, their concrete empires have been seized by the state, and the era of open violence has given way to quiet financialized survival. But the core economic lesson of the Sicilian Mafia remains intact. Whenever a state fails to guarantee basic trust, secure property rights, and enforce the rule of law, a private market for protection will emerge to fill the void. The flags changed. The state reasserted control. The underlying math never truly disappeared.